I believe that Andrew and Meghan have crossed paths. Why did they protect Andrew? And it might be because Andrew could have fired back and said that he does, in fact, know Meghan.
Meghan Markle's twisted Andrew Mountbatten Windsor plot has just been rumbled.
For months, sources close to the situation had whispered that negotiations between Harry and Meghan had become, and I quote, extraordinarily acrimonious. And isn't that a delicious understatement? Extraordinarily acrimonious. As if the entire Montecito saga hadn't been one long exercise in acrimony dressed up in Givenchy. The deal itself, reportedly finalized in a private mediation session in Los Angeles, covered everything. Custody schedules, holiday arrangements, media exposure clauses, educational provisions, travel restrictions. 94 pages, let that number breathe for a moment. For context, the Magna Carta, the foundational document of English liberty, was roughly 3,500 words. Harry and Meghan needed 94 pages just to agree on who gets the children on Boxing Day. But within that document, according to multiple sources now speaking with increasing boldness, were clauses that raise very pointed questions. Clauses about information sharing, clauses about non-disclosure, clauses about, and this is where it gets genuinely extraordinary, the limitation of contact between the children and certain members of the extended royal family. Not the king, not William, not Catherine. Andrew. Now why, you might reasonably ask, would Prince Andrew feature so prominently in a custody agreement between Harry and Meghan that he required specific, dedicated legal language? Hold that question, we'll come back to it, because the answer is the thread that, when pulled, unravels everything. First, let's talk about what Harry reportedly did the moment that agreement was signed. Sources describe a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. A man who, once the legal shackles of marital discretion were removed, began to speak first to close confidants, then to intermediaries, and eventually, through carefully placed channels, to people who would ensure the information reached exactly where it needed to go. The palace, the press, the public. And what he revealed was this, that during their marriage, Meghan Markle had cultivated a private, strategic, and deeply inappropriate relationship with Prince Andrew, one that went far beyond casual family acquaintance, far beyond the occasional awkward encounter at a royal gathering.
Fergie is preparing to go nuclear, to drop the bomb that for a long time she has resisted as she grifts for money from whoever is likely to give her a handout.
Let's be absolutely precise about what is being alleged here. We are talking about a clandestine communication channel, secret meetings arranged through intermediaries, a mutual exchange of information, strategy, and, according to the most explosive claims, emotional and personal intimacy that crossed every conceivable boundary of propriety, family loyalty, and basic human decency. The Duchess of Sussex and the Duke of York, behind closed doors, while Harry, according to those who know him, had absolutely no idea. Or did he? To understand how this alleged relationship even became possible, you have to understand something fundamental about Meghan Markle, something that her most ardent defenders have never been able to adequately explain away. She collects useful people the way other people collect stamps, methodically, strategically, and she discards them with the same casual efficiency when their utility expires. We've seen the pattern before, haven't we? The father, abandoned when he became inconvenient. The first husband, replaced when a more advantageous option presented itself. The friends Ninaki Priddy, Jessica Mulrooney, the Suits cast members, each one jettisoned at the precise moment they ceased to serve her upward trajectory. But Andrew was different. Andrew was useful in a way that nobody else in the royal family could be. Think about it, by the time Meghan entered the royal orbit, Andrew was already the family pariah, disgraced, stripped of titles, persona non grata at every official function. He was, in the language of intelligence services, a compromised asset, someone with enormous insider knowledge, existing relationships, and institutional memory, but with absolutely no remaining loyalty to the institution that had cast him out. Sound like anyone else we know? The parallels between Meghan and Andrew are, when you examine them honestly, almost uncanny. Both felt rejected by the institution. Both harbored deep resentment toward the family hierarchy. Both believed, with varying degrees of justification, that they had been treated unfairly by the palace machinery, and both were willing to operate outside conventional boundaries to pursue their own interests. They were, in essence, two outcasts who found each other, and what they built together, behind those closed doors, was reportedly something far more calculated than a mere friendship. According to sources close to Harry's camp, and let me stress, these are sources that have proven reliable on previous disclosures, the relationship between Meghan and Andrew operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On one level, there was information exchange. Andrew, for all his disgrace, retained an extraordinary knowledge of royal finances, property arrangements, trust structures, and family vulnerabilities. Information that would be, shall we say, extremely valuable to someone engaged in ongoing negotiations, whether marital, financial, or reputational, with the Crown. On another level, there was strategic coordination. Both Meghan and Andrew had, at various points, engaged legal and PR teams to manage their public narratives. The allegation is that these efforts were not independent, that there was active coordination, shared intelligence about palace decision-making, and collaborative timing of public statements designed to maximize pressure on the institution from multiple fronts simultaneously. And on a third level, the level that Harry himself found most devastating, there was personal intimacy that went beyond anything that could be characterized as innocent or familial. Now I want to pause here and acknowledge something. These are extraordinary claims, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We are not in the business of rumor-mongering on this channel. We deal in documented patterns, corroborated sources, and verifiable facts wherever possible. But consider the following documented facts.
Because it is Fergie, of course, who could reveal all about what really went on with this couple and the British royal family and Andrew behind the scenes. New reporting on this from Radar Online.
Meghan and Andrew were both present at multiple private gatherings that were not on any official schedule. Communication records, referenced but not yet publicly released, allegedly show a frequency of contact between the two that stunned even Harry's legal team when it was discovered during the custody proceedings. Andrew's own camp has been conspicuously silent on these allegations, not denying them, not confirming them, simply silent. And in royal circles, silence is never accidental. Silence is a strategy. And finally, Harry, upon discovering the full extent of this relationship, reportedly described himself as feeling, and I quote the source directly, physically sick. So how did Harry find out? The answer, like so many pivotal moments in this saga, is simultaneously mundane and devastating. It was the lawyers, of course it was the lawyers. During the discovery phase of the custody negotiations, that brutal forensic process where every text message, every email, every financial transaction is laid bare on the conference table, Harry's legal team uncovered a communication trail that they initially assumed was routine family correspondence. It wasn't. The messages, reportedly spanning a period of well over 18 months, painted a picture of a relationship that was anything but routine. Late-night communications, coded language, references to meetings that had taken place without Harry's knowledge, discussions about financial arrangements that had never been disclosed, and personal exchanges of a nature that, according to one legal source, made several members of the legal team visibly uncomfortable. Harry's reported reaction went through several distinct phases. First, disbelief. This is the man who had defended Meghan against the world, who had severed ties with his own family, who had walked away from everything he had ever known, and he could not, initially, process the idea that the betrayal could run this deep. Then came anger, a cold, crystallizing anger that those close to him describe as unlike anything they had ever witnessed from the normally affable prince. This was not the hot-headed Harry of tabloid legend. This was something quieter and far more dangerous, the anger of a man who realizes he has been comprehensively, systematically deceived. And finally, and this is the phase that ultimately proved most consequential, came calculation. Because Harry, whatever his other qualities, is not stupid. And he understood, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that the information he now possessed was not just personally devastating, it was strategically nuclear. And so the custody agreement became something more than a custody agreement. It became a negotiation conducted in the shadow of mutually assured destruction. Meghan knew that Harry knew. Harry knew that Meghan knew that he knew. And the 94 pages of legal text became the battlefield on which two people who had once promised to love each other until death traded provisions and clauses like generals trading territory at the end of a war that had left no survivors. The specific clause about Andrew, the one limiting contact, was, according to legal analysts who have reviewed comparable documents, extraordinary in its specificity. It didn't merely restrict contact. It created a documented, legally enforceable barrier, one that, if violated, would trigger consequences that sources describe as comprehensive and immediate. In other words, Harry didn't just sign a custody deal. He built a legal fortress. and the moat around that fortress was everything he now knew about what Meghan and Andrew had done behind closed doors. The fallout from these revelations, still emerging, still evolving, operates on multiple levels that we need to examine separately. For Meghan, the implications are severe. Her entire post-royal brand has been constructed on a very specific narrative. The independent woman who escaped a suffocating institution, who chose authenticity over tradition, who was driven out by racism and jealousy. That narrative requires, absolutely demands, that she remain the sympathetic protagonist. An alleged secret relationship with Prince Andrew doesn't just damage that narrative, it obliterates it. Because Andrew is not merely controversial. Andrew is toxic. Andrew is the man whose association with Jeffrey Epstein made him the most reviled royal figure of the modern era. Andrew is the man that even the most forgiving members of the British public view with unconcealed contempt. And the idea that Meghan, self-proclaimed feminist, champion of women's empowerment, patron of organizations dedicated to protecting vulnerable women, would voluntarily, secretly, and intimately align herself with that man, the cognitive dissonance is staggering. The hypocrisy, if proven, is without parallel in modern celebrity culture. Consider what this means for every interview she has given, every speech about female empowerment, every carefully staged appearance at charitable events, every Instagram post radiating authenticity and vulnerability. All of it, reframed by this single revelation. This is the woman who sat across from Oprah Winfrey and presented herself as the victim of an unfeeling institution, who spoke movingly about mental health struggles and suicidal ideation, who accused unnamed members of the royal family of racism. And all the while, if these allegations hold, she was conducting a clandestine relationship with the most disgraced member of that very family. Not in spite of his disgrace, but seemingly, at least in part, because of it. Because his disgrace made him available, made him useful, made him willing to share information and access that no one in good standing would ever have provided. For Andrew, the implications are equally devastating, though for different reasons. Whatever microscopic hope remained that he might one day rehabilitate his public image, that hope is now extinguished. The idea that he was engaged in a secret relationship with his nephew's wife adds a layer of familial betrayal that even the British public's legendary capacity for royal forgiveness cannot accommodate. And for Harry, poor, bewildered, perpetually manipulated Harry, the revelations represent both a catastrophe and, paradoxically, a liberation. A catastrophe because they confirm what his family had been trying to tell him for years, that the woman he loved, the woman for whom he sacrificed everything, was never what she appeared to be. That the fairy tale was fiction, that the authenticity was performance, that the love, if it was ever love, was conditional, strategic, and ultimately expendable. But a liberation because, for the first time, Harry can see clearly. The fog of infatuation, of loyalty, of the desperate need to believe that his choices were right, that fog has lifted. And what he sees in that clear and unforgiving light is the truth. So where does this leave us? It leaves us, I think, at a moment of reckoning, not just for Meghanmarkle, not just for Prince Andrew, but for all of us who watched this saga unfold and chose sides. Because the truth, the uncomfortable, inconvenient, deeply unsatisfying truth, is that the signs were always there. The pattern was always visible to anyone willing to look at it honestly. The relentless social climbing, the discarded relationships, the weaponization of victimhood, the strategic deployment of accusations designed not to illuminate truth but to deflect scrutiny, the constant, exhausting need to control every narrative, every image, every public perception. None of this was hidden. It was all conducted in plain sight. We simply chose, many of us, not to see it. And now Harry has laid it bare. Not through another ghost-written memoir, not through another sympathetic interview with a compliant journalist, but through the cold, unromantic mechanism of a custody agreement, 94 pages that tell the real story of a marriage, a betrayal, and a deception that will echo through royal history for decades. Meghan Markle arrived in the royal family promising to modernize it. Instead, she may have done something far more remarkable. She united the British public in a consensus that transcends politics, class, and generation. The consensus that she was, from the beginning, exactly what her critics said she was. And the alliance with Andrew, that secret, toxic, indefensible alliance, is the final damning piece of evidence. There will be more revelations. There always are. The legal proceedings will continue. The sources will keep talking. The documents will eventually surface. And when they do, the picture will become even clearer, even more devastating, even more impossible to dismiss. But for now, for this moment, let us simply acknowledge what we are witnessing. The end of the greatest royal deception of the modern era, told not by the tabloids, not by the palace, not by the commentariat, but by the one person who was closest to it, who suffered the most from it, and who finally found the courage to speak. Nobody saw it coming. That's the part that still catches people off guard when you lay out the full timeline, not the separation itself, that had been written on the wall in letters large enough to read from space. Not the legal proceedings, not the custody negotiations, not even the rumors that had been quietly circulating in certain very well-connected circles for the better part of a year. What nobody saw coming was what Harry did next. Because when a man of his background, his upbringing, his particular brand of emotionally compartmentalized British stoicism finally decides to stop protecting someone, he doesn't do it loudly. He doesn't call a press conference. He doesn't fire off a statement through a publicist. He does it quietly, methodically, and with the kind of precision that suggests he has been thinking about it for a very long time. And Harry, it now appears, had been thinking about it for a very long time indeed. The custody agreement had been signed. The ink was dry. The children's schedules had been carved up with surgical precision across those now infamous 94 pages of legal documentation. And the very moment that final signature was witnessed and the document sealed, something shifted. A door opened that had been firmly, deliberately, and perhaps strategically shut for years. And through that door walked a story that has left seasoned royal watchers, legal analysts, and Westminster insiders genuinely struggling to find adequate historical comparison. So let's walk through it together, carefully, because the details matter enormously here, and the details are where the truth lives. Begin with Meghan Markle, because you always have to begin with Meghan Markle. Not because she demands it, though she frequently does, but because in this particular story, every thread leads back to her. Every decision, every alliance, every carefully constructed relationship. All roads, as they say, led to Rome. And in this particular saga, Rome is a sprawling Montecito mansion where the curtains are always drawn and the phone calls are never quite what they appear to be. The woman who arrived in British royal life in 2017 presented herself in a very specific way. Warm, genuine, progressive, a breath of fresh California air in the musty corridors of tradition and protocol. And there were millions of people, genuinely, sincerely, who believed it, who wanted to believe it. Who saw in her arrival something hopeful and modern and long overdue. But belief, as it turns out, is a remarkably fragile thing when it comes into contact with evidence. And the evidence slowly, then rapidly, then all at once, began to tell a very different story. Not the story of a warm and genuine woman navigating an unfamiliar institution with grace and humility, but the story of a woman who had spent years, decades, arguably, constructing a persona with the kind of meticulous, architectural precision that most people reserve for their professional ambitions rather than their personal identities. Every relationship in Meghan Markle's life, when examined with honest eyes, follows the same pattern. Entry, cultivation, extraction, disposal. The variables change, the names, the circumstances, the specific utility being extracted, but the pattern itself is as consistent as a heartbeat. Her father, Thomas Markle, was useful until he wasn't. Her first marriage to Trevor Engelson served its purpose, and was concluded with an efficiency that those close to him still describe as startling. The friendships that defined her pre-royal life, relationships she spoke about publicly with apparent warmth and affection, evaporated the moment they ceased to serve the upward direction of her trajectory. And Harry himself, the ultimate prize, the ultimate utility, the ultimate vehicle for a level of global platform that no Hollywood career could ever have delivered, Harry too, it now appears, was always going to be expendable once the platform had been secured and the brand had been established. But before Harry was discarded, there was Andrew. And that is where this story takes a turn that even the most cynical royal observers struggled to anticipate. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, is by any reasonable measure the most catastrophically self-destructed figure in the modern history of the British royal family. His association with convicted sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, his disastrous 2019 Newsnight interview, still studied in journalism schools as a masterclass in how not to handle a crisis, and his subsequent stripping of military titles and royal patronages had rendered him, in the eyes of most British people, somewhere between a national embarrassment and an active liability. He was radioactive, politically, socially, institutionally. The family had distanced themselves from him with a thoroughness that left no room for ambiguity. He was out, finished, a cautionary tale told in the present tense. And yet, according to the revelations now emerging from sources connected to Harry's legal and personal inner circle, Meghan Markle had not distanced herself from Andrew. quite the opposite. While the world watched Andrew's public humiliation unfold, while the palace quietly but firmly closed every door in his direction, while his own daughters maintained carefully managed public neutrality, while even his most loyal defenders began to quietly disappear, Meghan had allegedly been doing something entirely different. She had been getting closer. Not publicly, never publicly. That would have been catastrophically counterproductive, and whatever else you might say about Meghan Markle, she has never lacked for strategic intelligence. The proximity was private, protected, conducted through intermediaries and back channels with the kind of operational discretion that speaks to either very careful planning or very experienced practice.
Meghan, when they go through their, separation, whatever, and she comes out with a book or a show, whatever, she is going to say, this is why I had to take my kids out of the palace. This is why I had to leave. You guys thought that it was about me.
Possibly both. The question that immediately presents itself is the most obvious one. Why? Why would a woman of Meghan's carefully curated public image, feminist, progressive, champion of the vulnerable, cultivate any kind of private relationship with the most disgraced man in Britain? A man whose name had become synonymous with precisely the kind of exploitation and abuse of power that she had built her entire brand around opposing. The answer, when you examine it through the cold lens of strategic interest rather than the warm lens of charitable interpretation, is actually quite straightforward. Andrew was useful. Specifically, Andrew possessed three things that Meghan needed and that nobody else in her orbit could provide. The first was institutional knowledge. Andrew had spent decades operating at the very highest levels of the royal institution. He knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes quite literally in a metaphorical sense, in terms of financial arrangements, property holdings, trust structures, lines of succession, and the internal power dynamics of a family that conducts its most consequential business entirely away from public scrutiny. For someone engaged in an ongoing and increasingly adversarial negotiation with that institution, this knowledge was not merely valuable, it was potentially decisive. The second was shared grievance. Andrew believed, and in certain specific respects, not entirely without justification, that he had been sacrificed by the institution for reasons of political and reputational convenience, that the family had prioritized its own survival over his, that loyalty in the end had flowed in only one direction. Sound familiar? The parallel with Meghan's own stated grievances against the palace is so precise as to be almost architectural. Two people who had been, in their own telling, betrayed by the same institution. Two people with every reason to cooperate against a common adversary. And the third, the most explosive, the most consequential, the most personally devastating to Harry, was something that went beyond strategy and information and shared political interest. Something that sources describe in terms that leave very little room for innocent interpretation. Harry's discovery of the full nature of this relationship did not happen the way these things happen in films. There was no single dramatic moment of revelation, no confrontation across a sunlit room, no letter discovered in a jacket pocket. It happened in a law office in Los Angeles, across a conference table covered in printed documents, during the forensic excavation of digital communications that had been assumed, by at least one party, to be either deleted or beyond reach. They were neither. Harry's legal team, assembled with the kind of resources that only genuine royal wealth can command, had conducted what those familiar with the process describe as an extraordinarily thorough discovery process. Every device, every account, every communication platform, every deleted file that could be recovered, and a remarkable number can be recovered when you have the right people and the right tools and a sufficient financial incentive to be thorough. What they found, spread across hundreds of pages of printed communications, was a correspondence that bore no resemblance to the occasional polite family exchange that anyone might have assumed existed between a duchess and a disgraced duke. The volume alone was startling. Messages spanning 18 months or more, in some cases multiple exchanges within a single day. References to meetings, physical meetings, not virtual, not phone calls, but in-person encounters at locations that had been selected, sources allege, with some care for their discretion. Financial discussions that touched on matters Harry had no knowledge of. Strategic conversations about legal and public relations, approaches that bore a striking similarity to positions that were subsequently adopted publicly. And personal exchanges, the nature of which, according to those who reviewed them as part of the legal process, went considerably further than anything that could be accommodated within the definition of family correspondence. The legal team's initial response, when the full picture began to emerge from the documentation, was by multiple accounts, one of stunned silence. These are professionals, people who have spent careers processing human behavior at its most complex and its most compromised. People who are, by professional necessity, largely immune to shock. They were not immune to this. And when the information was conveyed to Harry himself, through the careful and considered process that good legal counsel uses to deliver devastating news to a client, his response reportedly confirmed something that those around him had suspected for some time. That somewhere beneath the confused, manipulated, institutionally gaslit exterior that Harry had presented to the world for the better part of 5 years, somewhere beneath all of that, there was a man who had, on some level, always known that something was profoundly wrong. The specific word he used, according to a source with direct knowledge of the conversation, was betrayal. Not shock, not disbelief, betrayal. As if the confirmation of what he now knew had landed not as a revelation, but as a verdict on something he had long suspected but been unable or unwilling to articulate. What happened next unfolded with a speed and a deliberateness that surprised even those familiar with Harry's capacity for decisive action when sufficiently motivated. The custody negotiations, which had been proceeding with the grinding slowness characteristic of proceedings involving this level of legal complexity and personal acrimony, suddenly accelerated, dramatically. Sources on both sides of the negotiation describe a shift in the dynamic that was palpable and immediate. Where there had been extended back and forth on even the most minor provisions, there was suddenly a new atmosphere at the table. One side, Meghan's, had become, in the words of one legal observer, notably more accommodating. Provisions that had previously been contested with vigor were conceded. Positions that had been maintained with apparent inflexibility were quietly abandoned. The reason, those familiar with the proceedings suggest, requires no elaborate explanation. Meghan knew what Harry knew, and she understood with absolute clarity the implications of that knowledge in the context of a legal proceeding that was already public enough to cause significant reputational damage if its contents became more widely known. The clause about Andrew, buried within the 94 pages with the kind of careful legal language that is designed to be technically precise while being publicly opaque, was not, those who have reviewed comparable documents suggest, a standard provision. It was specific, it was enforceable, and it was in the assessment of at least one senior family law specialist who has reviewed its general terms, unlike anything they had encountered in a custody agreement at this level. It didn't merely address the children's contact with Andrew. It created a framework of documentation, reporting, and consequence that effectively made any future contact, of any kind, at any level, a matter of legal record with defined ramifications. Harry had not merely negotiated a custody agreement. He had constructed a legal instrument of considerable sophistication, one that would ensure that whatever had happened behind those closed doors could never happen again without consequences that neither party could afford. The broader implications of all of this deserve to be examined with the same careful attention that we've brought to the specifics. For Meghan Markle, the revelations represent something categorically different from the controversies that have surrounded her since she first stepped onto the royal stage. The arguments about her conduct toward palace staff, the questions about her public statements and their relationship to verifiable fact, the Oprah interview and its extraordinary claims, the Netflix documentary and its selective presentation of events, the memoir contributions and their creative relationship with documented history. All of those controversies, whatever their individual merits, operated within a framework that Meghan had constructed and largely controlled. She was always in those situations the author of her own narrative, the editor of her own story, the one deciding what was revealed, what was withheld, and how the available information was framed for maximum sympathetic impact. This is different. This is a situation in which the narrative is being authored by someone else entirely, by the legal process, by the documents that legal process has surfaced, by the communications that were assumed to be private and have proven not to be, and by Harry, who is, for the first time in their shared public story, the one controlling the flow of information rather than the one being managed by it. The specific devastation for her brand lies in the identity of the person involved. Had these allegations concerned almost anyone else, a Hollywood figure, a political contact, even another member of the extended royal circle, the damage, while significant, might have been manageable. Brands have survived infidelity allegations before. They have survived accusations of hypocrisy before. The machinery of celebrity rehabilitation is well-oiled and experienced. But Andrew is the one figure in British public life against whom there is no rehabilitation play, no redemption arc, no sympathetic reframing. He is the embodiment of everything that Meghan Markle's public persona has positioned itself against. And the idea that she chose, actively, secretly, repeatedly, to align herself with him in ways that went beyond any professional or familial necessity is not a complication her brand can absorb. It is a contradiction her brand cannot survive. For Andrew, the calculus is simpler and more final. There was nothing left to lose, and he has now lost it. Whatever private hopes he harbored for some eventual restoration, some quiet rehabilitation conducted at sufficient distance from the most damaging period of his public life, those hopes are now concluded. A man who cannot rehabilitate himself after Epstein certainly cannot rehabilitate himself after this. And for Harry, and I say this with genuine rather than performative sympathy, because whatever his failures of judgment over the past several years, he remains a man who was profoundly and comprehensively deceived. For Harry, this moment is the beginning of something rather than the end. The questions that remain are significant and will not be resolved quickly. What precisely do the communications contain, beyond what sources have been willing to describe? Will the custody agreement's full provisions ever become public, or will the legal protections surrounding family court proceedings keep its most extraordinary clauses permanently sealed? Will Andrew respond, and if so, how and through what channel? Will Meghan's legal team attempt to challenge the characterization of events that is now circulating with increasing confidence through well-sourced royal and legal commentary? And most pressingly, what does Harry do next? Because Harry, having spent 5 years as the passive subject of a narrative constructed by someone else, appears to have found something in this process that he had largely been missing: agency, the capacity to determine for himself what is revealed and what is withheld. The understanding that the information he possesses is not merely personally significant but publicly consequential, and the willingness for the first time to act on that understanding. He is not, sources suggest, finished. The custody agreement was the foundation. The Andrew revelations were the first floor, and those who know him best, those who have known him longest, who remember the man he was before Montecito, before the Netflix deals, before the ghost-written confessions, those people suggest, with quiet but consistent confidence, that Harry has significantly more to say. The question is not whether the next revelation comes. The question is when, and whether, when it arrives, there will be anything left of Meghan Markle's carefully constructed public identity to receive it. Based on current trajectories, the answer to that question is becoming clearer by the day. What we are witnessing, when you step back from the individual details and look at the full shape of this story, is something that royal history has rarely produced in quite this form. Not a scandal that erupts and fades, not a controversy that burns bright and is managed into irrelevance by the well-resourced machinery of royal and celebrity public relations, but a slow, structural, irreversible collapse. The kind that happens not because of a single catastrophic event, but because the foundations were never sound. Because the thing being built was always constructed on concealment rather than truth, on performance rather than substance, on the calculated exploitation of people who believed they were loved. Those foundations are now being examined, document by document, message by message, clause by 94-page clause. And what is being found beneath them is not pretty. It is not sympathetic. It is not the story of a misunderstood woman treated unfairly by an ancient institution and a hostile press. It is the story of a series of choices, deliberate, strategic, consequential choices, made by a person who understood exactly what she was doing and calculated, incorrectly as it turns out, that she would never have to account for them. She is accounting for them now. Harry has made sure of that, quietly, methodically, with the kind of patience that only someone who has been waiting a very long time finally gets to exercise. And the accounting, it appears, has only just begun. She smiled for the cameras. She always smiled for the cameras. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Meghan Markle before we get into the substance of what has now emerged. Before we examine the revelations, the documents, the communications, the legal architecture that Harry has spent the better part of the last year quietly and methodically constructing around the truth of what happened inside that marriage. She smiled, warmly, consistently, with the practiced, photogenic ease of someone who had spent years in front of a lens and understood, at a cellular level, the precise relationship between a well-deployed smile and public sympathy. And the public, by and large, smiled back. That exchange, that transaction of warmth and its reciprocation, is the foundation upon which everything Meghan Markle built in this country was constructed. The goodwill, the progressive credentials, the carefully cultivated image of a woman who was simultaneously extraordinary and relatable, glamorous and authentic, ambitious and humble. a woman who had everything and wanted only to give back. It was a magnificent performance, genuinely, technically magnificent. Even those of us who watched it with a degree of professional skepticism had to acknowledge the craft involved. But performances, however technically accomplished, have a fundamental vulnerability. They require the performer to control the environment, the lighting, the script, the audience, the narrative. And Meghan Markle has lost control of the narrative. Not gradually, not partially, completely. Because Harry has talked, and what he has said, what he has revealed about the months and years of deception that were conducted, apparently, with breathtaking audacity right under his nose, has not merely damaged the performance. It has exposed the machinery behind it, the wires and pulleys and trapdoors, the gap between the woman on the stage and the woman in the wings. And at the center of that exposure is a name that nobody expected to find there. Prince Andrew. Let us establish the landscape clearly before we proceed, because context here is not merely helpful, it is essential. By the time Meghan Markle became a fixture of royal life, the institution she was joining was already navigating one of the most turbulent periods in its modern history. The Queen was in the final chapter of a reign that had spanned 7 decades. The question of the monarchy's long-term relevance to a changing Britain was being asked with increasing directness. And within the family itself, the tensions that would eventually produce the most dramatic royal rupture since the abdication were already present, if not yet visible to the public eye. Into this environment arrived Meghan, and whatever the complexity of what followed, it is worth acknowledging that her arrival was initially received, both publicly and within the institution itself, with considerable warmth. She was different, refreshing. The monarchy, which had spent decades struggling to demonstrate its relevance to younger and more diverse audiences, suddenly had a member who embodied that relevance in the most visible possible way. The goodwill was real, the opportunity was genuine, and the squandering of both was a choice, not an inevitability, not a product of institutional racism or press hostility or any of the other explanations that have been offered with such regularity, but a choice, made deliberately, repeatedly, with full awareness of the consequences. Those choices are now, in a very direct and legally consequential sense, coming home. The custody agreement, 94 pages of it, was the moment that the bill came due. And what was written in those 94 pages, and what Harry revealed in the aftermath of signing them, has transformed what might have been a relatively contained royal divorce into something with implications that extend far beyond the personal lives of 2 people in Montecito. Prince Andrew's presence in this story requires careful, honest examination, because the instinct, when his name first surfaces in this context, is to dismiss it. Surely not. Surely the connection is tangential. Surely there is an innocent explanation, a family event, a chance encounter, the ordinary proximity that comes with belonging, however tenuously, to the same extended family. That instinct toward charitable interpretation is understandable. It is also, the evidence now suggests, entirely misplaced. Andrew, by the time of the events in question, was not a man with whom accidental proximity was plausible. He had been so thoroughly excised from official royal life, so completely removed from the events, gatherings, and functions at which members of the family might naturally encounter one another, that any contact with him was, by definition, intentional. You did not run into Andrew at a state dinner, because Andrew was not at state dinners. You did not encounter him at a garden party or a trooping rehearsal or a Commonwealth reception. He was not there. He had not been there for years. The institution had ensured his absence from every space in which accidental contact might occur. Which means that contact, when it happened, was sought. And according to the picture assembled from the communications discovered during Harry's custody proceedings, communications that Harry's legal team has described, through carefully chosen intermediary language, as extensive and of a deeply troubling nature, contact was sought, repeatedly, consistently, over a period that sources suggest spans the better part of 2 years. Let that settle for a moment. Not a single encounter, not a brief flirtation with the dangerous novelty of associating with the family's most toxic member. A sustained, deliberate, carefully managed relationship conducted over an extended period, while Harry was present in the house, present in the marriage, present in the life that was being constructed around him as an elaborate piece of theatre. The audacity of it is, depending on your temperament, either breathtaking or entirely consistent with everything we have come to understand about how Meghan Markle operates. The nature of the relationship between Meghan and Andrew, as it has been characterized by those with access to the communications and meetings now under examination, existed on what sources describe as several distinct but interconnected levels. The first level was informational. Andrew, stripped of his official roles and his public platform, but possessed of decades of intimate knowledge about the institution that had discarded him, represented an extraordinary intelligence resource for someone engaged in ongoing hostilities with that institution. The internal finances of the royal household, the legal structures governing royal property and trusts, the personal vulnerabilities of individual family members, the historical precedents for various forms of royal dispute, the precise mechanisms by which the palace exerts pressure on those it wishes to control or marginalize. All of this knowledge, accumulated over a lifetime of proximity to power, was, in Andrew's post-disgrace isolation, sitting largely unused. He had no platform from which to deploy it, no allies willing to receive it through conventional channels, no remaining institutional position from which it might serve any strategic purpose. Until Meghan. The second level was strategic. The allegation, and it is an allegation, though one supported by what sources describe as considerable documentary evidence, is that the PR and legal strategies pursued publicly by Meghan and those pursued more quietly by Andrew during overlapping periods show signs of coordination that go beyond coincidence. Timing of statements, choice of legal venues, framing of grievances against the palace, selection of sympathetic intermediaries.
Harry and Meg are lucky that the Andrew scandal is going on because it deflects from their own actions and failures. They've done so much damage to the royal family, so if anything, it's the other way around. And the media focus on Andrew is to deflect from scandals surrounding Harry and his darling wife. I could be wrong. Maybe Harry and his wife are jealous that Andrew is getting more media attention than they are, regardless of the specifics.
The fingerprints of a shared strategic intelligence, sources suggest, are visible across multiple public actions if you know what you are looking for. And the third level, the one that Harry found most personally devastating, the one that sources indicate caused the physical and emotional response that those around him have described as unlike anything they had witnessed from him before, was personal, intimate, a dimension of the relationship that crossed every boundary that family, marriage, and basic human decency would ordinarily impose. The precise nature of this personal dimension has not been fully characterized in any public forum. The legal protections surrounding the custody proceedings ensure that the specific content of the communications remains, for now, technically sealed. But the characterizations offered by those with access to them, the language used, the visible reactions of legal professionals who reviewed them, the specific provisions written into the custody agreement as a direct consequence of what was discovered, all of this paints a picture that requires very little imaginative effort to complete. Harry's journey to this point, to the moment when he sat in a law office in Los Angeles and looked at printed pages that told him the full truth of what had been happening in his marriage, is a journey that deserves honest examination rather than the reflexive sympathy or reflexive dismissal that it tends to attract depending on who is doing the examining. Because Harry is not and has never been a simple figure. He is a man of genuine contradictions, emotionally intelligent in some respects, catastrophically naive in others. Capable of both considerable courage, his military service was real, and his willingness to challenge institutional practices that caused genuine harm was legitimate, and considerable foolishness. His departure from royal life, whatever the circumstances that motivated it, was handled with a gracelessness that caused real damage to people who loved him, and to an institution that, whatever its flaws, represents something genuinely important to millions of people. He is not a hero of this story, he is a participant in it, a man who made choices to believe what he was told, to prioritize what he was shown over what he was not shown, to construct his understanding of his marriage around the performance rather than the reality. But he is also, and this matters, a man who was deceived, profoundly and systematically deceived, by someone who understood his emotional vulnerabilities with surgical precision and exploited them with a consistency that, when the full picture becomes clear, is deeply uncomfortable to contemplate. The man who emerges from the custody proceedings is not the bewildered, manipulated Harry of the opera era, not the tearful, aggrieved Harry of the Netflix confessional, not even the wounded, angry Harry of the memoir. This is a different version, quieter, more certain, a man who has processed what he knows and decided with apparent calm what he is going to do with it. And what he has decided to do with it is, in its own way, the most consequential decision he has made since he walked away from royal life. He has decided to let the truth out. Not in a blaze of publicity, not through a tearful interview with a sympathetic host on a sympathetic network, but through the slow, methodical, legally protected process of disclosure, through custody proceedings, through sourced conversations with trusted intermediaries, through the steady accumulation of documented fact that builds, over time, into something that cannot be managed or reframed or dismissed. The question of what this means for Meghan's public identity is one that her defenders will find deeply uncomfortable to engage with honestly. And so, in the interest of that honesty, let us engage with it directly. Meghan Markle built her post-royal brand on a series of interconnected pillars: authenticity, vulnerability, feminist principle, the courage to speak truth to power, the willingness to sacrifice comfort and privilege for the sake of integrity. Each of those pillars, examined against the backdrop of what is now emerging, presents a problem. Authenticity, the claim that what you see is what you get, that the public persona and the private person are the same, is perhaps the most fundamental casualty. A woman conducting a sustained clandestine relationship with one of the most problematic figures in British public life, while simultaneously presenting herself as the very embodiment of openness and honesty, has not merely failed the standard of authenticity, she has inverted it. Feminist principle, perhaps the most politically loaded of her brand pillars, faces the most philosophically devastating challenge. The specific individual with whom these allegations connect her is a man whose public disgrace stems directly from accusations of the exploitation of vulnerable women. There is no universe in which a genuine commitment to feminist principle accommodates a secret, intimate relationship with that man. The contradiction is not a nuance to be navigated. It is an abyss. Vulnerability, the carefully deployed emotional openness that produced some of her most publicly resonant moments, including the Oprah interview and various public speeches about mental health, now reads, in the light of these revelations, as something considerably less than what it appeared to be. Vulnerability, authentically expressed, requires honesty about the full complexity of a person's experience. Selective vulnerability, the sharing of carefully chosen difficulties while concealing choices and behaviors that would fundamentally alter public perception, is not vulnerability at all. It is its sophisticated opposite. And the courage to speak truth to power, the framing that has underpinned her public criticism of the royal institution, her allegations against unnamed family members, her characterization of herself as a whistleblower against a corrupt and racist establishment, this too collapses entirely when placed alongside the revelation that she was simultaneously, secretly, collaborating with the institution's most disgraced member in ways that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with strategic advantage. You cannot be both the principled critic of a corrupt system and the covert ally of the system's most comprehensively corrupted figure. The two positions are irreconcilable, and the attempt to occupy both simultaneously is not complexity or nuance. It is hypocrisy of a scale that is genuinely difficult to overstate. Andrew's position in all of this is simultaneously simpler and more pitiable than Meghan's. Simpler because there is no brand left to destroy. The destruction was complete before this story emerged. His association with Epstein, his Newsnight interview, the civil settlement, the withdrawal of titles, all of this had already reduced him to a figure of almost universal contempt in the country of his birth. Adding this to the record does not transform the picture. It merely adds a final, almost redundant stroke to a portrait already beyond salvage. More pitiable because Andrew, whatever his many and serious failings, is also in his own way a man who was used. His isolation, his resentment, his desperate hunger for relevance and connection in the vacuum left by his disgrace, all of these vulnerabilities were visible. And visible vulnerabilities to someone with Meghan's particular skill set are not weaknesses to be handled with care. They are opportunities. The suggestion that Andrew was, to some significant degree, as much a tool in Meghan's strategic arsenal as a genuine participant in a mutual relationship, is one that will not sit comfortably with those inclined towards simple narratives of villainy and victimhood. But it is a suggestion that the evidence, as characterized by those familiar with the communications, supports with uncomfortable consistency. He was useful, he was used, and when the use was discovered and the legal consequences began to crystallize, he was in the great tradition of everyone who has served Meghan Markle's purposes and outlived their utility, abandoned. The silence from his camp in response to these allegations is not the silence of a man with nothing to say. It is the silence of a man who has finally understood, too late, the nature of the transaction he entered into. Where does the story go from here? The honest answer is that nobody knows with certainty. Royal stories of this complexity rarely follow predictable trajectories. The variables are too numerous, the interests too divergent, the legal landscape too intricate. But certain things can be said with reasonable confidence. The custody agreement, with its specific and enforceable provisions, creates a legal framework that will govern the public behavior of both parties for years. Neither can speak freely about the other on matters covered by its terms. Neither can take actions that would constitute violations of its provisions without triggering consequences they cannot afford. In this sense, Harry has achieved something that years of more conventional conflict could not: a legally binding constraint on the behavior of someone whose behavior has, until now, operated largely without constraint. The communications discovered during the proceedings are not going to simply disappear. They exist. They have been reviewed by legal professionals whose professional obligations extend beyond the immediate proceedings. They are referenced, however obliquely, in documents that are part of a legal record. The probability that they remain entirely sealed indefinitely is, in the assessment of those familiar with how these processes tend to unfold, significantly lower than either party might hope. And Harry, having discovered within himself the capacity for the kind of patient, methodical, legally sophisticated action that this situation has required, is not, sources consistently suggest, finished. The custody agreement was a beginning. The revelations that followed its signing were a first chapter. What comes next is not yet fully visible, but the direction of travel is not ambiguous. The truth, it appears, has found an advocate, a reluctant one perhaps, a flawed one certainly, but an advocate nonetheless. And the truth, once it has found an advocate, tends to be remarkably difficult to put back in the box. There is a version of this story that Meghan Markle's supporters will want to tell. There always is. There has been a counter-narrative to every development in this saga, deployed with considerable speed and some sophistication every time a new piece of uncomfortable information has emerged. This time, the counter-narrative will be harder to construct. Not impossible, the machinery of celebrity reputation management is resilient and experienced and very well funded, but harder. Because the challenge this time is not one of interpretation. It is not a matter of framing ambiguous events in the most favorable light. It is not even a matter of challenging the credibility of individual sources, though that effort will certainly be made. The challenge this time is the documents, the communications, the legally discoverable record of what was said, when to whom, and in what context. These are not susceptible to reframing in the way that personal recollections and anonymous allegations are. They say what they say, they record what they record, and they exist in a legal framework that makes their management significantly more difficult than the management of a sympathetic interview or a carefully timed public statement. Meghan Markle has spent her public life controlling the story, writing herself as the protagonist, positioning every critic as a villain, every challenge as an injustice, every failure as evidence of the world's prejudice rather than her own choices. The story is no longer hers to write. Harry is writing it now, in legal language, in documented fact, in 94 pages of carefully constructed truth that will outlast every counter-narrative, every sympathetic profile, every tearful television appearance that the machinery of her rehabilitation might produce. And the name that appears in those pages, the name that nobody expected, the name that changes everything, is the name that will follow her story wherever it goes from here. Andrew. The man she thought nobody would ever find, the relationship she thought would never surface, the secret she calculated, incorrectly, fatally, perhaps irreversibly incorrectly, that she could keep. She could not keep it. And now the whole world knows why. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something genuinely irreversible has just happened. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of confusion, but the silence of finality. The silence that arrives when the last door closes, when the last option disappears, when the last carefully constructed defense finally gives way under the weight of documented, verifiable, legally consequential truth. That silence fell over a very specific set of rooms in the past several weeks. Rooms in Lowe's Angels, rooms in Windsor, rooms in the offices of some of the most expensive legal and public relations firms that money, and there is a great deal of money on multiple sides of this particular conflict, can retain. And the reason for that silence is Harry. Not the Harry that the media constructed during the opera years. Not the tearful, wounded, somewhat bewildered figure who sat in a Californian garden and told the world that his family had failed him. Not the Harry of the Netflix documentary, gazing soulfully into middle distance while a carefully selected soundtrack underscored his grievances. Not even the Harry of the memoir, whose ghost-written confessions managed the remarkable feat of making almost everyone who read them feel simultaneously sorry for him and frustrated by him. A different Harry entirely. A Harry who has been quiet, methodical, patient in a way that nobody who had observed his public behavior over the previous 5 years would have predicted. A Harry who apparently spent a significant period assembling something, not a book deal, not a television project, not another round of carefully managed media appearances, but a legal and evidentiary case of sufficient weight and specificity to fundamentally alter the landscape of everything that comes next. And at the center of that case, the revelation that has produced the silence, the finality, the closing of doors, is a secret that two people believed was permanently, safely buried. It wasn't buried deeply enough. To understand the full significance of what has emerged, you need to understand something about the architecture of Meghan Markle's public life that her most devoted supporters have consistently refused to examine honestly. Everything is constructed, everything is deliberate. Nothing, not a single public appearance, not a single interview, not a single carefully leaked anecdote about her private warmth and generosity, happens by accident or spontaneity. This is not in itself an unusual characteristic in someone who has spent their adult life in the public eye. Celebrities manage their images, public figures curate their narratives, politicians construct their personas. This is the ordinary business of public life in the media age, and it would be both naive and unfair to single out Meghan Markle for doing what virtually everyone in her position does. What is unusual, what elevates her particular brand of image management from the ordinary to the extraordinary, is the scale of the gap between the constructed persona and the documented reality, the distance between the performance and the truth, the sheer ambition of the project she undertook, and the lengths to which she was apparently willing to go to sustain it.